The 17th of August, 1943, 25,000 feet above Schweinfurt, Germany. The thin air cut like glass as Oberleutnant Heinz Knoke's oxygen mask stiffened with ice against his face. Through the canopy of his Messerschmitt Bf 109, the morning sun refracted off something so immense, so alien, that it felt like watching a mountain range on the move. From horizon to horizon stretched an endless silver tide, 376 B-17 flying fortresses, their polished skins catching every ray of light until the sky itself seemed to glitter. They advanced in perfect combat boxes, layer upon layer, each fortress bristling with 13 50 caliber machine guns, enough firepower to weave walls of lead across the heavens. Knoke's squadron, barely 40 fighters strong, clawed for altitude, engines strained, radios crackled with clipped orders. He had faced danger before over France, Britain, Russia, but never odds like this. This was not the duel of hunters he once relished. This was a mathematical storm, an industrial onslaught beyond anything the Luftwaffe had prepared for. What began as a single mission, Mission 84, the double strike on Regensburg and Schweinfurt, was more than an air raid. It marked the visible moment when the air war tilted irreversibly. The sky over Germany no longer belonged to Germany. Only 3 years earlier, the Luftwaffe had ruled those same skies with near total supremacy. In 1940, its pilots wrote the textbook on modern air combat. But by mid-1943, the industrial engines of the United States had transformed the balance of power. This is the story of how courage met production, how skill met mathematics, and how even the finest pilots in the world were swept aside by a tide of machine. The staggering sight above Schweinfurt on the 17th of August, 1943, was no accident. It was the outcome of a calculated, continent-wide effort that had been building for years in the factories and planning rooms of the United States. When the Luftwaffe conquered Europe in 1940, German pilots believed they had secured a permanent advantage. Their training was the envy of the world over 250 hours of flying, relentless aerobatics, and formation practice. Their aircraft, like the nimble Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the powerful Focke-Wulf WF 190, had proven their worth over Poland, France, and the skies of Britain. At that time, German intelligence comforted itself with a crucial assumption: that America's industrial strength was limited by distance, by resources, and by politics. They estimated U.S. aircraft production at perhaps 18,000 planes a year, maybe 30,000 at the outside. They were disastrously wrong. In 1942, American plants produced 47,836 aircraft, more than double German estimates. By 1943, production leapt again to 85,898. At Boeing's Seattle facility, workers turned out 16 B-17 flying fortresses every single day. At Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan, the assembly lines could finish a B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes. Across the country, hundreds of thousands of men and women labored in shifts around the clock. For every German pilot entering combat, America trained and equipped several, each with more flight hours than his opponent could hope for. This industrial miracle underpinned the strategic concept of deep daylight bombing to cripple the Reich not just by burning cities, but by dismantling its ability to make war at all. The targets chosen for Mission 84 were therefore precise and devastating. First, the Messerschmitt plant at Regensburg, responsible for nearly 1/3 of Germany's single-engine fighter production. Without those fighters, German skies would eventually lie open. Second, the ball-bearing works at Schweinfurt, supplying every tank, tread, aircraft propeller, and gun turret in the Reich. A single ball-bearing failure could halt an entire tank factory. Striking both targets on the same day was a bold gamble. Regensburg lay far to the southeast, Schweinfurt to the north. The plan called for splitting the attacking force into two, forcing the Luftwaffe to divide as well. Colonel Curtis LeMay's 4th Bombardment Wing led 146 B-17 toward Regensburg, while 230 bombers from the 1st Bombardment Wing set a course for Schweinfurt. Each flying fortress bristled with 13.50 caliber machine guns, from the chin turret to the tail stinger. Flying in combat box formations 18 to 21, planes interlocked for overlapping fields of fire, they could unleash walls of lead so dense that frontal attacks verged on suicide. For the Luftwaffe, the mission posed a nightmare equation. Adolf Galland, Germany's celebrated fighter commander, scrambled every available machine. JG-1 from Denmark and Schiphol, JG-11 from Jever and Oldenburg, JG-26 from Lille and Wevelgem. Yet all he could put into the air at first contact were a few dozen fighters against hundreds of bombers and their growing fighter escort. The mathematics was merciless. Even the bravest pilots understood they were flying into an industrial hurricane, one that no individual courage could contain. For a brief moment, the Luftwaffe believed it had found an answer. 2 months after the Regensburg Schweinfurt mission, on the 14th of October, 1943, a second great raid targeted Schweinfurt alone. What followed became known as Black Thursday, a day both sides would never forget. At dawn, 291 B-17 flying fortresses from the 8th Air Force crossed into German airspace. This time, the Luftwaffe met them in force. More than 300 fighters, drawn from 24 airfields, clawed skyward. Veteran units, JG-1, JG-11, JG-26, and others threw everything they had into the battle. Pilots armed their Focke-Wulf FW-190 with WGR-21 rockets, unguided missiles designed to explode within the dense bomber formations. Messerschmitt Bf-109 dove head-on through streams of defensive fire, some pilots dropping bombs directly into the tight combat boxes. The sky turned into a moving wall of fire and steel. From inside the B-17, crews felt each near miss as a violent shudder, the smell of cordite filling their oxygen-starved cabins. From the cockpits of German fighters, the scene was even more surreal. Tracer rounds arcing like molten rain, entire formations firing in unison, a living fortress of metal and flame. By day's end, 60 American bombers were destroyed, a staggering 20% loss rate. Survivors limped home on shredded wings, their fuselages riddled with holes, their crews dead or wounded. For the United States, Black Thursday represented the costliest single mission of the war so far. Yet, the apparent German victory masked a deeper, fatal arithmetic. The Luftwaffe lost 35 to 38 fighters, and far worse, many of its most experienced pilots, men with hundreds of combat hours and finely honed instincts. Among them was Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland, younger brother of the famed ace Adolf Galland. His death was more than a personal tragedy. It meant the loss of irreplaceable expertise at a time when every veteran mattered. The training pipeline could not keep up. Before the war, German fighter pilots logged more than 250 hours of flight training, mastering aerobatics, formation tactics, and gunnery. By late 1943, fuel shortages and mounting pressure cut that to barely 112 hours, often incomplete. Johannes Steinhoff, one of Germany's most celebrated aces, later wrote that many new arrivals had perhaps 100 hours total flying time, maybe 10 on the Bf-109. We were supposed to make them combat ready in 2 weeks. Most were dead within their first 5 missions. American numbers told the opposite story. U.S. airmen typically trained 300 hours or more, arriving in Europe thoroughly prepared. And American factories, unlike their German counterparts, could absorb terrible losses and replace machines almost overnight. The 8th Air Force could lose 60 bombers and still fly another mission the next morning with fresh crews and newly built planes. By the end of 1943, the equation was merciless. Every German pilot lost represented months of irreplaceable training. Every American bomber lost represented a few days on an assembly line. Black Thursday, far from halting the offensive, revealed the underlying truth. In a war of production, even tactical victories could be strategic defeats. The smoke of Black Thursday still hung over Europe when another turning point began to unfold, the long-range fighter revolution that would seal the Luftwaffe's fate. Until late 1943, German pilots relied on one enduring hope. The deep penetration bombers would eventually have to fly without escort. For much of the war, that hope held true. P-38 Lightnings and early P-47 Thunderbolts lacked the range to accompany B-17 all the way to their inland targets. Luftwaffe commanders timed their climbs to meet the bombers as they turned for home, mauling stragglers with deadly ambushes. But the Americans were already closing that gap. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, rugged and heavily armed, was adapted with drop tanks that nearly doubled its combat radius. By the closing months of 1943, these Thunderbolts were flying far deeper into Germany, meeting bombers not only on the way out, but on the way back. Suddenly, Luftwaffe interception windows began to shrink. Then came the machine that changed everything, the North American P-51 Mustang. Streamlined, fast, and perfectly suited to high-altitude escort, the P-51 combined excellent speed with the range to reach Berlin and return. By early March 1944, formations of silver Mustangs were sweeping across the German heartland, waiting above and behind the bomber streams. They did not merely protect, they hunted. For German pilots, the change was immediate and devastating. Hans Joachim Hajo Hermann, architect of wild new tactics like night fighter head-on attacks, recalled his disbelief at seeing American fighters still circling over Berlin hours after the bombers had departed. He and his comrades now had to fight simply to reach the bombers at all. Interception runs began with dogfights against prowling escorts and often ended with crippled aircraft long before the bomber formations even appeared in sight. Desperate times demanded desperate measures. The Luftwaffe introduced Sturmgruppen, special assault formations of heavily armored Focke-Wulf FW 190 carrying 30mm cannons. These pilots were expected to drive into bomber boxes at point-blank range, sometimes even ramming the enemy if their ammunition ran dry. The courage required was almost inconceivable. A reinforced nose and thick cockpit glass might buy seconds of survival, but rarely escape. Other experiments bordered on science fiction. Knoke himself pioneered a technique of dropping small bombs from fighters directly onto B-17 formations from above, and units like JG-11 adopted BR-21 rocket launchers, firing time-fused 21 cm projectiles to disrupt the tight boxes. Though occasionally successful, these innovations were pinpricks against the swelling Allied presence. Even Germany's most revolutionary weapon, the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter, could not tip the scale. Capable of 540 miles per hour, far faster than any Allied piston aircraft, it should have been a game changer. But Hitler delayed its deployment by insisting on a bomber role, and by the time dedicated fighter units like Jägerschwader 7 finally took to the air, fuel shortages and thin training meant only 30 jets might sortie at once. By early 1944, one truth had settled over every German airfield from Denmark to Bavaria. The Luftwaffe no longer dictated when and where to fight. The Americans did. And soon, an even larger blow planned with industrial precision would follow. The knockout phase began in February 1944 with Operation Argument, better known as Big Week. From the 20th of February to 25, the US 8th Air Force launched a relentless assault aimed at Germany's aircraft industry itself. Day after day, more than 3,000 bomber sorties, backed by hundreds of escort fighters, struck at production centers across Leipzig, Regensburg, Augsburg, Stuttgart, and Schweinfurt. At night, the Royal Air Force added its own hammer blows. For the Luftwaffe, Big Week was a test of pure survival. At best, 150 to 200 fighters could be scrambled at once. Jägerschwader units that once took pride in tightly choreographed ambushes were now throwing every available plane into the sky, often with barely serviceable engines and crews that had trained for only a handful of hours. The results were catastrophic. By the end of that single week, the Luftwaffe had lost 262 fighters and roughly 100 irreplaceable veteran pilots, men whose names had once filled propaganda posters and victory rolls. Among them was Hauptmann Kurt Euben, holder of the Knight's Cross and veteran of more than 100 victories. He would never fly again. The Americans suffered heavy losses, 226 bombers and 28 fighters, but their factories replaced them almost overnight. Within days, new B-17 and P-51 were rolling off assembly lines, their crews already trained and waiting. For Germany, each lost ace represented months of fuel, training, and experience that simply no longer existed. And Big Week was only the beginning. From late spring 1944, the Allies shifted focus to Germany's synthetic fuel network, the true lifeblood of the Luftwaffe. On May 12, 1944, 935 American bombers struck critical hydrogenation plants. The effect was immediate and devastating. Production, which had stood at 175,000 tons in April, plunged to 52,000 inches June, 35,000 inches July, and a mere 5,000 by September. Without fuel, aircraft became useless steel. Training flights were slashed to the bone. By late 1944, many young pilots received only one training sortie per month, hardly enough to master takeoffs and landings, let alone dogfighting. Operational units rationed every drop. Ground crews resorted to towing fighters with oxen to conserve gasoline. Some frontline squadrons reported that they could launch just one mission per week. Johannes Steinhoff, by then one of Germany's most seasoned commanders, recalled the slow-motion collapse. "We were supposed to create combat pilots in 2 weeks. Most were dead within 5 missions. The fuel was gone. The sky belonged to the Americans before we even took off." The irony was brutal. Albert Speer's industrial reforms pushed aircraft production to its wartime peak in 1944, nearly 40,000 planes, including 25,000 fighters. Yet most of those machines never left the ground. By November, training flights were virtually suspended. By February 1945, synthetic fuel output had fallen to less than 1% of its early 1944 level. Big Week and the oil campaign didn't merely erode Germany's air defenses, they strangled them outright, proving that victory in modern war belonged not only to those who fought bravely in the sky, but to the nations capable of keeping those skies filled with machines and fuel. By the time the Allies stormed the beaches of Normandy on the 6th of June, 1944, the Luftwaffe was already a shadow of its former self. Once capable of dominating entire theaters, it now struggled to mount even token resistance over its own territory. The scale of Allied air power on D-Day was staggering. From dawn to nightfall, 11,590 sorties thundered over the invasion coast. Fighters, bombers, reconnaissance planes, and transports forming an unbroken chain across the channel. Against this armada, Luftflotte 3, the air fleet responsible for defending France, could launch barely 319 sorties, and of those, only 35 were flown by fighters. One of the day's most famous stories illustrates the futility. Josef Pips Priller, commander of Jagdgeschwader 26, was among the very few Luftwaffe pilots able to take off. With only his wingman, Heinz, Priller raced toward the Normandy beaches. At 8:30 a.m., they made a single, low-level strafing pass over Sword Beach, their 20mm cannon shells sparking harmlessly in the sand before racing back to their airfield. That brief, almost ceremonial attack represented virtually the entire Luftwaffe fighter contribution to the first day of the greatest amphibious invasion in history. Behind that dramatic collapse lay months of relentless attrition. Between January and June 1944, Germany's key fighter wings bled themselves dry. JG-26 lost 58 pilots killed. JG-2 Richthofen Verlor 67. JG-11, once famed for its aggressive anti-bomber tactics, lost 73. When Priller took command of JG-26 Inches, January 1943, 23 of his pilots had more than 100 missions experience. By D-Day, only 3 veterans remained. Even the new graduates, often boys barely out of school, were doomed. In December 1943, the class of Jagdfliegerschule 5/52 proudly received their wings. Within 3 months, 80% were dead. The material situation was just as grim. Germany might still list over 1,000 operational fighters on paper, but most sat grounded. Synthetic fuel plants bombed to rubble left squadrons with barely 10% of their minimum needs. Engines seized from lack of maintenance, and pilots rationed precious flight hours to a single training sortie per month. In many units, aircraft were literally towed by oxen to preserve every drop of aviation gasoline. In the skies above Normandy, these realities collided with Allied supremacy. Waves of Spitfires, P-47 Thunderbolts, and P-51 Mustangs roamed freely, cutting down the few German fighters that managed to take off. Radar screens, once filled with confident formation markers, now showed only thin, isolated blips. What had begun as a slow bleed in 1943 had become complete air paralysis by the summer of 1944. For Luftwaffe pilots like Johannes Steinhoff and Heinz Knoke, the transformation was absolute. 4 years earlier, they had entered the war as hunters. Now they flew if they could fly at all, knowing they were targets unable to protect their own soldiers, their own cities, or even their own airfields. D-Day did not merely mark the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany on the ground. It signaled that the air war was already lost, and that the Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe had been reduced to scattered fragments beneath an Allied sky, it no longer controlled. As the war dragged into its last winter, the Luftwaffe's remaining pilots faced a reality more crushing than any dogfight. The men who had once thrilled at the freedom of the hunt were now flying towards certain defeat, and they knew it. Veteran ace Johannes Steinhoff, who survived 993 combat missions, later recalled the steady erosion of spirit. In 1940, we were hunters. By 1943, we were hunted. By 1944, we were simply targets. His words capture the inner journey of an entire generation of German airmen. They began the war believing themselves masters of the sky. They ended it as reluctant witnesses to their own irrelevance. Major Heinz Bear, credited with 221 victories, described the same grim arc. In 1940, we owned the sky. In 1941, we shared it with the RAF. By 1943, we disputed it with the Americans. By 1944, we were merely trying to survive in it. Their memoirs are not boasts, but elegies, charting the psychological collapse of a force once unmatched. Some tried to fight back in ways that defied imagination. The Sturmgruppen special assault units of Focke-Wulf FW 190 were designed to fly directly into the dense formations of B-17, using heavy armor and 30mm cannons to break the boxes from within. When ammunition ran out, pilots were expected to ram the bombers, chopping through wings or tails with their propellers. These missions demanded almost suicidal courage and underscored how completely traditional tactics had failed. Desperation also sparked dissent. On the 22nd of January, 1945, Germany's most decorated aces, including Adolf Galland, Steinhoff, Günther Lützow, and Hannes Trautloff, gathered in Berlin for what became known as the Fighter Pilots' Revolt. They confronted Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring directly, accusing him of strategic incompetence and pleading for immediate deployment of the revolutionary Me-262 jet fighter as a pure interceptor. Göring raged, threatened courts-martial, and even dismissed Galland, but he did not execute them. By then, even Hitler's regime recognized that these men, national heroes, all could no longer be sacrificed without consequence. Yet, nothing could alter the arithmetic. The Me-262, capable of 540 miles per hour and theoretically able to outclass any Allied piston engine fighter, arrived too late and in too few numbers. Fuel shortages and lack of trained jet pilots meant that Jagdgeschwader 7, the main operational jet wing, could rarely launch more than 30 aircraft at a time. Against 1,000-plane Allied raids, even miracle technology was meaningless. By early 1945, German airfields were littered with aircraft that could not fly, and the men who had once been Europe's most feared hunters had become witnesses to the death of the ace era itself. They flew their last missions out of habit, duty, or a simple refusal to surrender, fully aware that each takeoff might end in flames and that victory was impossible. The psychological weight of this knowledge was immense. As Steinhoff later wrote, by the time these events took place, the leaders of the Reich had abandoned every standard of responsible action, both toward their own people and toward the enemy. We were caught in the middle of this madness. It was the final transformation of the Luftwaffe pilot from hunter to survivor, and finally, to tragic witness of an industrial war that had rendered individual courage obsolete. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe existed more on paper than in the sky. Of more than 1,000 fighters listed as operational, barely 100 could actually take off each day. Most pilots were limited to one sortie a week. Many of the young men arriving from the crippled training system had fewer than 50 hours of flight time, some barely able to land safely, let alone fight. Fuel starvation finished what American bombers had begun. Germany's synthetic oil production, which in early 1944 still delivered 124,000 barrels a day, fell to a fraction of 1% of that figure by February 1945. Aircraft were towed by oxen to conserve the last drops of gasoline. Even the magnificent Messerschmitt Me-262 jet, a plane that could outrun and outclimb anything the Allies fielded, sat idle for lack of fuel and trained pilots. The Luftwaffe's physical destruction was staggering. About 77,000 aircraft lost, including 43,000 inches combat. Human losses were just as severe: 165,000 aircrew killed, 155,000 wounded, and 192,000 captured or missing. The 8th Air Force, by contrast, lost 26,000 men out of 350,000 who served. Heavy losses, yes, but ones that American industry and manpower could absorb. More revealing still was the balance sheet of production. In 1944 alone, the Allies built 163,000 aircraft. Germany, despite its desperate spear miracle, managed fewer than 40,000, many of which never left the ground. German intelligence had once scoffed at American numbers, believing reports of 3,000 fighters a month to be propaganda. In reality, US factories were producing over 3,600 fighters monthly. No amount of courage or tactical brilliance could alter that equation. The psychological shift among Germany's elite pilots mirrored these hard numbers. Major Heinz, who had welcomed the war in 1940 with youthful excitement, later admitted that by 1944 he and his comrades were flying merely to survive. Johannes Steinhoff described the final months with bitter clarity. In 1940, we were hunters. By 1943, we were hunted. By 1944, we were simply targets. They fought on, not expecting victory, but out of duty, habit, or because they knew nothing else. When the fighter pilots' revolt erupted in January 1945, it was less a bid to win than an act of collective recognition that the war in the air was lost and that continued sacrifice was pointless. Even the promise of the jet age could not reverse what sheer industrial capacity had already decided. The end came not with one final battle, but as a slow, inevitable silence. Airfields once loud with engines fell quiet. Skies once ruled by aces were filled instead with the endless hum of Allied formations. The era of the individual air hero, the ace, was over. The destruction of the Luftwaffe remains one of the clearest lessons in modern warfare. It shows that courage and skill, however great, cannot overcome the mathematics of mass production and logistics. The men who faced those vast silver bomber streams in 1943 and 1944 fought bravely, but they fought a war already lost, defeated not by lack of valor, but by an enemy that had turned war itself into an industrial equation.